Here we go. I was like, how do we do this? Good morning, everyone. Many thanks to the conference organizers for having me here today. So let's see if I can advance the slides here. Here we go. So my standard disclaimer slide, these opinions are my own and not those of the Army or the Department of Defense. So obesity has been posited as a threat to national security, and we know that obesity is associated with negative health implications, which drive up healthcare costs. For example, in 2007, it was reported that the armed services spent about $1.5 billion annually for obesity-related healthcare expenses and costs to replace unfit military personnel. And this dollar amount hasn't been recalculated since 2007, and it does not include long-term disability costs, so it may actually be an underestimation. What's potentially more troublesome is the effect of obesity on lost work days, degraded readiness and resilience, higher need for aeromedical evacuation, and ineligibility in recruitment of military personnel. So about a third of US adults are overweight and almost 40% are obese, which is certainly relevant to the Department of Defense because we recruit our members from the general population. And this figure that you see on the screen here is from Mission Readiness. It uses the DoD's 2017 analysis of NHANES to determine the percentage of Americans ages 17 to 24 that would not qualify for military service due to health, physical appearance, criminal history, and educational background. On this figure, the darker the shading, the higher the rate of ineligibility. For example, Hawaii in yellow has the lowest rate of ineligible 17 to 24-year-olds at 62%, while the District of Columbia in maroon has the highest rate at 78%. Important to note that a majority of our military enlistees the majority of our enlistees originate from the areas with the highest rates of ineligibility. The leading cause of ineligibility from this data is overweight, wherein approximately 1/3 of 17 to 24-year-olds are too overweight to qualify for the military. And of note, this data did use a BMI of 27.5 to calculate that. As the upper, because that's the upper limit for military service for most age and sex. So of note, these figures take into account the height and weight data from NHANES, and we know that determining eligibility is a two-step process, and body fat is really the end-all and be-all there. And so he or she undergoes the circumference measurements to determine whether they meet or exceed the body fat standards. So we're going to take this one step further to look at how this translates to individuals who actually apply for military service. This is 2014 data, and it consists of, the 2014 data considers applicants, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Oh, so this slide here shows, it's 2008 data, and it's the percentage of, it's the percentage that actually, it looks at body fat in addition to body weight. So this data takes for Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and it actually importantly looks at the body, the weight for height, as well as the body fat for each specific service, looking at the enlistment age requirements as well, because each service has different age requirements. And so you can see for the Army, it's about men, it is 12%, and you can see the women on the screen as well as 35%. Navy, 13 and 21% are ineligible for service, taking into account the body weight as well as the body fat requirements. Air Force, 7 and 13%, and 5 and 16% for the Marine Corps. And again, it takes into account the different age requirements for each of the services as well. Approximately 9% of active component enlisted military applicants were disqualified due to obesity. So this actually takes it one step further and looks at those who actually apply for military service. This is 2014 data, and it considers applicants that undergo a physical at the military entrance processing station. When looking at the ICD-9 codes and applicants, approximately 9% of first-time active component enlisted applicants were coded for obesity and disqualified accordingly. And this is the second most common medical disqualification condition, the first being disorders of refraction at 15%. And this was actually down 4% from 13% compared to the prior 5-year period. When investigators looked at other medical failure codes provided by the U.S. Military Entrance Processing Command, about 16% of first-time active component enlisted applicants were disqualified due to the weight body build code. And the average rate of disqualification for all services due to weight body build actually decreased by 3% compared to the prior 5-year period. Of note, weight status is a temporary disqualifying condition that can be remediated by the applicant without the need for an accession medical waiver. So a report published by the Defense Health Board in 2013 indicates that existing recruitment and accession standards are not posing challenges for recruitment goals. And this finding was based on briefings from each of the service's recruiting commands. So while the services did grant more waivers to applicants receiving a weight disqualification for service in 2007 than in recent years, all services acknowledged that the 2007 was a particularly challenging year. And since then, recruitment targets have decreased due to the drawdown, and the recruiters are reporting that it actually has become easier to recruit healthy individuals. So the data I've presented thus far is for applicants, but let's see how this data compares to the accessions data. By accessions, I'm referring to applicants that have been accepted for service and move on to initial military training. So my colleagues and I looked at the change in weight status at Army accession between 1989 and 2012 and the demographic characteristics associated with overweight obesity at the time of accession. We use the Total Army Injury and Health Outcomes Database, which is a data repository housed at USAREUM that maintains records of administrative and health-related data sets on active duty Army soldiers to support epidemiological research. And the height and weight data we used for this analysis came from the Military Entrance Processing Command, and the demographics data came from the Defense Manpower Data Center. We conducted 2 separate analyses here. One identified overweight and obesity using the standard BMI cutoffs categories, and another looked at the prevalence of exceeding the Army's weight for height criteria. And I'll present the latter here today. The overall prevalence of exceeding the screening table weights increased with time, from a low of 5.7% in 1989 to almost 22% in 1992 with the introduction of body fat standards, to a high of 31% in 2006 and 2007, and then decreased to about 25% in 2012. In terms of demographic predictors for exceeding the screening table weights, in the latter years that we looked at, 2008 to 2012 timeframe, women were more than 35% less likely to exceed the guidelines compared to men, and there were some trends with age, wherein odds for exceeding the guidelines were higher for women that fell into the 20 to 29 or 30 to 39 age category, compared to those that were under 20 years old. There were no consistent trends of educational attainment, marital status, or geography with odds of exceeding the screening table weights. So my colleagues and I continued this work by conducting a prospective analysis examining the long-term impact of excess weight at accession on lower extremity musculoskeletal injuries and disorders, and I'm abbreviating that with the MID on the slide here. A total of about 740,000 soldiers were followed from accession in the Army during 2001 to 2011. And MID was categorized as any first incident lower extremity injury, musculoskeletal injury, or disorder. Approximately 400,000 cases of any first MID were documented in medical records, and overall MID rate was 2.62 per 100 person months. So relative to soldiers with normal BMI at accession, those who were underweight, overweight, or obese had 7, 11, and 33% respectively higher risk of MID. And that was after adjusting for age at baseline, sex, race, ethnicity, educational attainment, marital status, primary military occupation, and deployment history as well. The figure on the right shows the results of our adjusted hazard model, wherein the risk estimates are shown by the solid curve, and the gray section on the graph shows the 95% confidence interval. This analysis indicated that the risk was actually the lowest in soldiers who had a BMI of 21 to 23 at a session, and that's represented by the area that is circled in green on the screen. These injuries were apparent regardless of body fat at a session and or whether a soldier lost weight during their career. We were only looking at a session body weight, BMI here. This data is similar to other studies that had a shorter follow-up period. So taken together, BMI at a session certainly has important implications for injury risk and does support the importance of upper limits of BMI at a session. We further examine the health implications of overweight and obesity at a session by examining the association with incident cardiometabolic risk factors, which I've abbreviated as CRF on the screen. We use the same database, the TEHAD, that I've presented in the last few slides. CRF were defined as incident diagnoses from 2001 through 2011 by ICD-9 code of metabolic syndrome, glucose insulin disorder, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and overweight and obesity in those that weren't initially classified as overweight or obese. Incident CRF was generally low in this population, presumably because the population was relatively young and our follow-up time was relatively short during the 10-year sampling period. It was about 3.2 years. 228 soldiers, you can see from the screen, were diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. Up to about 26,000 were diagnosed with hypertension during this time period. Relative to soldiers who were normal weight at a session, those who were overweight or obese had a significantly higher risk for developing each CRF after multivariate adjustment. For example, the risk of hypertension in soldiers who were overweight or obese at a session was 1.85 times and more than 3 times the risk compared to those who were normal weight at a session. BMI in early adulthood has important implications for cardiometabolic events. And this is even in a population that has twice yearly PT tests and has to maintain a certain fitness level. And it's a young population as well. So for my last slide here, I'll end by discussing some practical applications relating to body composition during the recruitment and accession process. As I mentioned previously, in 2012, the Defense Health Board got together. They were actually tasked with addressing a number of key issues related to the national trends in overweight and obesity and implications for military personnel. I'm not going to review all of the issues that they were asked to explore and the resulting recommendations, but I will address 4 key points related to recruiting and retaining a fit force. First, the board was asked to evaluate whether or not the recruitment standards, the policies and standards with regard to body weight were adequate and appropriate. And findings indicated that existing standards were indeed appropriate and were not posing challenges to recruitment goals. However, the board noted that if it could change if recruitment demands increased, so it is something that should be followed periodically. Second, the board noted that it's difficult to assess actual recruitment losses related to overweight and obesity classifications since there's a lack of data indicating how many people are turned away from the recruitment stations. Soldiers or prospective applicants come and they may be turned away before they even get through that first medical exam, and we don't have those values. So they recommended that the MEP stations start collecting that data as well. Next, the board recommended that the DoD should conduct a pilot program to assess the feasibility of training recruiters to actually not only conduct the weights, but actually conduct the circumference measurements to identify applicants who may not meet the weight, but may meet the body fat. And last recommendation related to recruitment and retention was that current accession standards related to height, weight, or body fat should be maintained as a minimal requirement for all military personnel in order to ensure an agile and responsive fighting force and to continue to impose stricter standards for certain military occupational specialties such as special forces. So I think we'll take questions at the end.